The road into the mountains was barely more than a scar through the wilderness, swallowed by fog and silence. The deeper one drove, the older the world seemed to become, as if time itself had forgotten this place. Beyond the last gas station, past the dying oaks and the sagging power lines, lay a cluster of homes known to locals as Cradle Hollow, a name whispered more than spoken. It was there, one grey morning, that a baby girl was born without eyes. Not blind, eyeless. Her face smooth where sight should have been, a porcelain mask of something both innocent and wrong. The midwife who delivered her refused to touch the child again. She crossed herself and muttered prayers older than the church itself. The family, the Callaways, said little. They had seen things like this before, though not in many years. Behind their silence, there was no shock, only shame and something darker, a kind of weary acceptance. The mother rocked the baby in her arms while the wind howled through the cracked boards of their house, carrying with it a faint echo, as though the mountain itself was whispering its disapproval. News traveled slowly down in the hollow, but it always reached the edges eventually. By the time word reached the nearest town, the story had already twisted. Some said the baby was born with no soul, others that she was a warning, a reminder of sins that had gone unburied too long. For generations, the Callaways had married their own. Brothers to sisters, cousins to cousins, all bound by fear of outsiders and a belief that their blood carried something sacred. But now, the land seemed to reject them. The cattle died, the wells ran bitter, and the sound of crying came from the mines at night. When Dr. Samuel Hurst first arrived from Lexington, he thought it was just another rural medical anomaly, the kind of story that could make a career. But as he stood in that cabin, staring at the eyeless infant in her mother's trembling arms, he felt something shift in the air. The shadows in the corners seemed to breathe, and the wind pressing against the window panes sounded almost human. The child tilted her head toward him as if she could see through the dark. And then, in a voice too soft to be real, she laughed. That was when the doctor realized he hadn't just stepped into a case. He'd stepped into a curse. The town sat deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, far beyond where most maps bothered to mark. It wasn't a place you stumbled upon, you either belonged to it or you didn't know it existed. The mist clung to the ridges like a shroud, and the air smelled of wet earth and coal dust, as though the land itself was breathing. Only a handful of families lived there, bound by generations of survival, secrecy, and a bone-deep fear of the outside world. Among them, one name carried both respect and dread: the Callaways. They had lived in Cradle Hollow since before anyone could remember, long before the roads were paved and the mines dug. Their bloodline had grown inward, folding over itself, as cousin married cousin and uncle married niece. Outsiders were not just unwelcome, they were forbidden. It was said that the Callaways kept to themselves to protect their own, but the truth was far less noble. The isolation of Cradle Hollow wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The people believed the mountain watched them, that its forests had ears and its rivers carried voices. Old stories told of a pact made generations ago, a promise that as long as they stayed among their own, the mountain would feed them, shield them, and keep their secrets buried. But the cost of such promises has a way of multiplying over time. The Callaways began to change. Subtle at first, pale skin that never tanned, eyes that never quite met another's gaze, whispers of strange births that were quickly hushed. The family rarely ventured into town except when absolutely necessary, and when they did, they moved together, their faces drawn and their speech heavy with an accent that seemed older than English itself. To those who had left the hollow and tried to build lives elsewhere, returning always felt wrong. The silence there was heavier than any church prayer, and the woods were too still, as though waiting. Those who did return often spoke of an unshakable sense of being watched, of shadows shifting in the tree line even when no wind blew. And yet, for all their fear, none dared break the chain that bound them to their kin. Marrying outside the family wasn't merely discouraged, it was seen as betrayal, an invitation for the mountain's wrath. So, generation after generation, they looked inward, repeating the same names, the same faces, until their family tree no longer branched but twisted back upon itself. By the time the 20th century came crawling into the hollow, the Callaways were less a family than a relic, a living monument to their own seclusion. What began as loyalty had curdled into something grotesque, and beneath the quiet surface of the valley, something ancient had begun to stir. The night the baby was born, A storm rolled over the mountains like an animal waking from hibernation. The wind scraped against the tin roof of the Callaway cabin, and rain struck the windows with a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. The midwife, an old woman named Ruth, had delivered countless children in the hollow, but she had never seen anything like this. The baby came into the world silent, her tiny body slick and pale, her face turned away from the dim light of the kerosene lamp. When Ruth lifted the child to clean her, her breath caught in her throat. Where the eyes should have been, there was only smooth, unbroken skin, no sockets, no lashes, just blank flesh, perfect and horrifying. She froze, her hands trembling, the room falling into a stillness that felt like a held breath. The mother, weak and shivering, asked why the baby wasn't crying, but Ruth couldn't answer. When the infant finally let out a faint, mewling sound, it didn't sound like a cry of life. It sounded hollow, wrong, as though it came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. The mother began to sob, begging to hold her child, but when the baby was placed in her arms, she flinched. The child's face was strangely peaceful, as if untouched by suffering or emotion, but there was something unsettling about that blankness, something that felt less like a defect and more like a message. The father, a tall man with the hard hands of a miner, stood in the corner, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't move to comfort his wife. He just stared, pale as the lightning that flickered through the window, and whispered a single word under his breath again. Ruth looked at him sharply, realizing this wasn't the first time. The thought sent a chill through her bones. She had heard rumors over the years, stories of Callaway babies born wrong, buried quick and quiet before sunrise, the family whispering that the mountain had taken them back. But she had never believed them until now. As the storm raged outside, the father took a shovel and stepped into the rain, muttering about fetching wood for the fire. Ruth knew he wasn't going for wood. The mother clutched her child, rocking her, whispering prayers half in English, half in an old tongue no one outside the hollow would understand. The wind howled through the trees like a voice answering her. Somewhere deep in the forest, something groaned, not thunder, not animal, and Ruth felt the weight of an old curse pressing down on the cabin, older than blood, older than memory itself. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the hollow soaked and heavy with mist. Word of the eyeless child moved through the mountains faster than the wind that carried it. People in the scattered shacks and weather-beaten farms began to whisper the old name again, the hollow bloodline. It was a phrase that hadn't been spoken aloud in years, one that mothers used to hush children when the nights grew too long and the woods too loud. The stories said that the Callaways had once been chosen by something ancient that lived beneath the mountain, a spirit or curse, depending on who told it. Some said the family's strength came from that bond, others claimed it was their damnation. But after the birth of the eyeless baby, everyone agreed that whatever protection the Callaways once had was now gone. At the general store on the outskirts of town, the talk turned dark. Old men with faces carved by time and tobacco recalled the sightless ones that had been born generations ago. They remembered the preacher who came up the ridge to bless the family and vanished before dawn, his horse found days later by the river with its eyes missing. There were stories of how the mountain took back what it was owed, of how every sin buried in the hollow eventually clawed its way to the surface. For years, the Callaways had been left alone, tolerated but avoided, like a necessary shadow. Now, that shadow seemed to be stretching wider. The townsfolk, wary but curious, began making excuses to travel closer to the hollow. They brought food, pretended to offer help, but what they really wanted was to see the child. Each came back pale and quiet, refusing to speak of what they saw. One woman, known for her gossip, told a friend that the baby didn't blink, didn't flinch at light, but somehow followed people with her face like she could sense them even without eyes. By the next day, that woman's house caught fire, and the story was never repeated. Fear settled thick over the town. Some said the child was a punishment for the family's sins, others whispered it was the beginning of something worse, that the mountain was reclaiming its due. The local preacher tried to hold a gathering, urging the people not to fall into superstition, but even he refused to say the family's name from the pulpit. No one dared go near the hollow after sunset. Doors were bolted, candles burned low, and prayers were whispered to a god that seemed far away. In the silence that followed, The wind carried faint echoes from the valley, a baby's soft cooing, mingled with the rustle of trees, as if the mountain itself was listening and waiting. The arrival of the doctor broke the still rhythm of Cradle Hollow like a stone cast into stagnant water. Dr. Samuel Hurst was an outsider in every sense, his neatly pressed coat, his polished boots, his careful accent that carried no trace of the mountain drawl. He had heard whispers about the eyeless baby during his rounds in a nearby county hospital, passed along by a nurse who had grown up near the hollow and swore the story wasn't just a tale. At first, he dismissed it as mountain superstition, one of those bizarre rural legends that always seemed to mix sickness with sin. But something about the details, the child born with no eyes, the family that refused medical attention, the vanishing midwife, stirred a curiosity he couldn't ignore. Against the advice of his colleagues, he packed his bag, filled his car with fuel, and drove toward the fog-shrouded ridges where even the roads seemed to hesitate. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. The forest pressed close on either side, the branches heavy and low, and the sound of his tires on the gravel echoed unnaturally in the stillness. When he finally reached the hollow, the houses appeared suddenly from the mist, leaning and warped as if grown rather than built. The people who watched him from their porches did not wave or smile, they simply stared, their eyes dull, their faces drawn in suspicion. He asked for directions to the Calloway home, but most turned away before he finished his question. A few muttered that he should leave before nightfall. By the time he reached the cabin at the edge of the woods, evening had begun to bleed into the trees. The Calloways met him at the door, their expressions blank but not surprised, as though they had known he was coming. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wood. The doctor unpacked his instruments, speaking softly, trying to assure them he meant no harm, but his words fell flat against their silence. When he asked to examine the child, the mother hesitated. Her eyes darted to her husband, who gave a slow, reluctant nod. The doctor expected deformity, perhaps the absence of formed sockets, but what he saw was something that defied his training entirely. The skin where the eyes should have been was flawless, unbroken, like nature itself had decided to erase that part of her. As he touched the child's cheek, a sudden chill ran through him. The baby turned her face toward him, though she had no eyes to see, and smiled. At that moment, every whisper he had heard about curses and the hollow bloodline no longer felt like superstition. It felt like a warning he had arrived too late to heed. In the days that followed the doctor's arrival, the hollow began to change in ways that couldn't be measured by science or reason. The first sign came from the Calloway farm itself, when two calves were born twisted and limp, their spines arched unnaturally, their eyes milky white as if already blind. The family buried them before dawn, saying little, but the smell of decay lingered in the air long after the graves were covered. Then came the strange noises at night, the low hum of voices drifting through the trees, and the sound of crying that no one could quite locate. The older folks said it was just the mountain settling, but the younger ones swore they heard words in those cries, fragments of names long forgotten. Even the animals grew restless, refusing to go near the mine shafts that cut through the hill behind the Calloway property. Dr. Hurst stayed in the hollow, convinced there had to be an explanation. He began to keep notes on what he observed, scribbling by lamplight in the single room he rented from a widow at the edge of town. But the longer he stayed, the more the line between the rational and the impossible began to blur. Mirrors in his room cracked during the night, without sound or reason, the glass splitting down the middle like a wound. He replaced them, but each one shattered again within a day. The widow claimed it was the mountain's way of warning outsiders not to pry where they didn't belong. He laughed at first, but by the third night, even his laughter sounded hollow in the quiet. The Calloways grew increasingly uneasy. The mother of the eyeless child stopped answering the doctor's knocks, though he could sometimes hear her singing through the walls, a slow, tuneless melody that made the hairs on his arms rise. The father was seen digging near the mine at dusk, his lantern bobbing in the fog, but when questioned, he said nothing. The townsfolk began whispering that the mine was cursed, that the cries echoing from its tunnels weren't echoes at all but the voices of those buried deep beneath, trying to claw their way out. On the fifth night, the doctor stood by his window, unable to sleep, and saw the faint glow of movement near the Calloway home. A figure, small, childlike, stood at the edge of the woods, its head tilted toward the sky. Though it was too far to see clearly, He felt certain it was the infant, standing on her own, her smooth face turned toward the moon as if she were seeing something no human eyes were ever meant to behold. By the time the strange events had spread beyond the Callaway property, Dr. Hurst's fascination had shifted into obsession. He spent his days poring over dusty archives in the nearest county courthouse, searching for any record of the family's history, but found almost nothing. Birth certificates were missing, death records incomplete, and census lists showed gaps that made no sense. It was as if entire generations had been erased, blotted out from the public record. The few surviving documents were handwritten and brittle, their ink faded into spider-like traces. One birth record from the late 1800s mentioned an unnamed stillborn child with no visible eyes. Another, a coroner's report from 1912, noted that the cause of death for an infant had been complications of unnatural formation. Yet there were no follow-ups, no burial certificates, no trace of graves. It was as though the mountain itself had swallowed the evidence. When he returned to the hollow with his findings, the reaction was immediate. Doors that had once opened reluctantly now remained closed. Conversations stopped when he entered the general store. Even the children, who had watched him curiously before, now ran from him as though he carried some sickness. One night, as he walked back to his rented room, he found a folded piece of paper nailed to his door. There was no writing on it, only a black handprint smeared across the center, the print of a child's hand. He burned it in the stove, but the smell that rose from the fire was thick and foul, like burnt hair. Determined to learn the truth, he sought out the oldest resident of the hollow, a frail woman named Hetty who had lived through more winters than she could count. Her eyes were clouded, her voice like the creak of a door long unused. She told him what no one else would. The hollow had seen eyeless children before, more than once, always born to the same bloodline. Each time it happened, the town erased the evidence, burned the midwife's notes, buried the bodies in unmarked soil, and pretended it never occurred. They believed that speaking of it would wake whatever curse lay beneath the ground. Hetty said the last time it happened, lightning struck the church steeple and set the graveyard ablaze, leaving the earth blackened and the air thick with the smell of iron. The doctor listened, skeptical but shaken, and asked her what she thought caused it. She only smiled, a toothless, hollow grin, and whispered that some things weren't born wrong, they were made that way, piece by piece, by the hands of those who refused to stop touching what should have been left alone. The deeper Dr. Hurst dug into the Callaway history, the clearer it became that the family's secret wasn't simply neglect or misfortune, it was deliberate. Through fragments of letters and interviews with a few reluctant locals, he pieced together a truth that chilled him more than any ghost story ever could. The Callaways had spent nearly a century refusing to marry or reproduce with anyone outside their kin. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces, and sometimes even siblings were bound in secret unions blessed not by any church, but by old mountain rites whispered at night beneath the trees. The family claimed it was tradition, that they were protecting the old blood, something sacred that outsiders would taint. But the more the doctor read, the more he saw the pattern of deformity, children born weak, blind, or twisted, and yet the family persisted, generation after generation, as though chained to their own decay. He tried to confront the current patriarch, Elias Callaway, about what he discovered, but the man's expression didn't change. He merely stared at the doctor with eyes that seemed both vacant and knowing, and said the family had done what they must. When pressed, Elias spoke of the mountain's favor, an inheritance that ran deeper than flesh. He claimed that long ago, an ancestor had struck a bargain with something buried beneath the stone, something that promised their blood would never die out. To keep that promise, the family had to remain pure, untouched by outsiders, bound only to each other. Breaking that oath, Elias said, would wake the mountain's anger. Dr. Hurst dismissed it as folklore, yet something in the man's voice made him uneasy. He began to notice symbols carved into the trees near the Callaway home, strange, looping marks arranged in spirals. In one of the abandoned cabins, he found a child's toy carved from bone, its hollow eyes drilled through with unnatural precision. When he showed it to the local preacher, the man refused to touch it and warned him to leave before winter came. But Hurst couldn't leave. His curiosity had turned to compulsion, driven by the sense that he was standing on the edge of something vast and unexplainable. That night, as he wrote his notes by lamplight, he caught a reflection in the window, a faint movement behind him, like a figure standing just out of reach. He turned, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling remained, thick and heavy, as if unseen eyes were watching him. And when he looked down at his notebook again, he saw that his pen had continued to move on its own, spelling out a single word he didn't remember writing: belong. The discovery came one night when Dr. Hurst could no longer silence the pounding in his mind. The stories, the whispers, the half-truths had tangled together until he couldn't separate curiosity from dread. He decided to search the Calloway house himself, convinced that somewhere within those rotting walls was proof that would explain everything. The family was away, or so he believed, and the night was moonless, the fog thick enough to swallow sound. He crept through the creaking doorway with only a lantern in hand, its glow painting long, trembling shadows across the warped wood. The air inside was damp and sour, heavy with the scent of old smoke and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust or dried blood. Every step echoed like a whisper. The walls were lined with portraits of the family, generation after generation of pale faces, their eyes strangely mismatched, some so light they looked blind even when painted. None of them smiled. In the parlor, he noticed a trapdoor half hidden beneath a threadbare rug. It had been nailed shut from above, but the wood was soft and rotted. His hands shook as he pried it open, the nails screeching in protest. A cold breath rose from below, and the lantern flickered. The narrow stairs descended into blackness, the air growing colder with every step. The basement floor was made of packed dirt, and in the far corner, beneath a broken beam, he saw what looked like small shapes wrapped in linen, stacked neatly in rows. As he drew closer, he realized they weren't bundles of tools or fabric. They were tiny bodies. Infants. Their forms had been carefully arranged, some with deformities so severe they looked almost inhuman. A few were missing limbs, one had a mouth where an eye should have been. None had eyes. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, his lantern trembling in his hand. On the wall behind the row of remains, someone had carved symbols into the earth, crude spirals and crosses intertwined with names, Calloway names, each followed by a single mark that looked like an eye crossed out. He could hear his pulse thundering in his ears as he realized this wasn't just a burial place, it was a record. Generations of hidden shame catalogued in dirt and bone. As he turned to flee, a soft sound stopped him, a baby's coo, faint but unmistakable, coming from deeper in the shadows. He raised his lantern, and for an instant, he saw a face staring back at him, smooth and blank where eyes should have been, its mouth twisting into what might have been a smile. The lantern went out, and the darkness felt alive. When the doctor awoke the next morning, he was lying outside the Calloway cabin, the trapdoor sealed once more, his lantern shattered beside him. His clothes were damp with soil, and his hands were streaked with something dark that wasn't quite blood. He couldn't remember how he got there, only the feeling of being watched, the cold breath of something unseen pressing against his skin. He stumbled back to town, wild-eyed and trembling, muttering about the basement, but when he returned with help, the trapdoor was gone, the rug replaced, the boards newly nailed and clean. The Calloways denied everything. Elias claimed the doctor had never been in their home, and the mother of the eyeless child stood silent, her face as pale as the moon. The sheriff, uneasy but unwilling to stir trouble, told the doctor to let it go. In the hollow, people said, there were things better left unspoken. That night, unable to rest, Dr. Hurst found himself at Hetty's shack again. The old woman listened as he described what he'd seen, the bodies, the carvings, the sound of that impossible cry in the dark. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she told him that what he had found wasn't just the result of blood mixing too long within itself. It was the mountain's punishment made flesh. Long ago, the Calloways had broken a sacred order, she said, and their children bore the price of it. Each generation had carried the curse deeper into their bones, twisting them inside out until the spirit that once watched over them turned away. He tried to argue, tried to rationalize it as science, but her voice rose over his words. It's not sickness, she rasped. It's debt. Before he could speak again, she reached out and gripped his hand, her fingers cold and thin as twigs. She told him the curse could not be undone because it wasn't only in their flesh, it had taken root in their souls. What had begun as superstition had become a bond stronger than blood, passed down like inheritance. She warned him that once a man saw the truth beneath the hollow, It never let him go. He would carry it with him, in his dreams, in the corners of his vision, until he belonged to it too. Her words clung to him like frost as he left her home. That night, he dreamed of the infant again, standing at the foot of his bed, her blank face tilted upward, whispering in a voice that wasn't hers but his own. When he awoke, his mirror had cracked from corner to corner, and his reflection stared back at him with eyes that didn't seem entirely his. As the years passed, the eyeless child grew, and the hollow watched her like a silent jury. She moved with a quiet confidence that unsettled even the most seasoned residents, her small hands brushing against objects as if she could perceive the shape of the world without sight. The doctor remained in the mountains, driven by a combination of fascination and fear, but even he began to notice the ways in which she saw more than anyone else could. When she reached the age where most children learned to speak, she murmured names of people long dead, names of infants buried beneath the cabin floor, names of strangers who had passed through the hollow decades ago. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but it carried an authority that made the air around her tremble. The townsfolk, already uneasy about the Callaways, became terrified. Some claimed the child wandered the woods at night, speaking to shadows that answered her in whispers. Others said she appeared in dreams, her smooth face turned toward them, eyes blank but seeing, revealing memories and secrets that had been buried and forgotten. The doctor recorded everything, but even his journals felt insufficient, as if the words could not capture the true magnitude of what he was witnessing. He began to wonder if she was merely a product of bloodline and curse, or something far older, something the mountain itself had shaped in secret. People stopped visiting the hollow entirely, and those who remained spoke in hushed tones, afraid to draw attention. The child, despite her deformity, became the axis around which the valley seemed to turn. Even the animals, which had once shied away from the property, now circled her without fear, drawn to something unseen. On rare occasions, the doctor thought he glimpsed her staring at him from a distance, and although she had no eyes, it felt as though she knew the most intimate parts of his mind, the fears he had never spoken aloud. One evening, as a storm rolled over the mountains much like the one on the night of her birth, the doctor followed her into the woods. The fog was thick, the wind carrying voices he could not identify. She paused at the edge of a clearing, and he saw the shapes of bones scattered among the roots, the remnants of infants whose faces had been blank like hers. She lifted her head, tilting it toward the moonless sky, and whispered a single word, faint yet clear, remember. The wind shifted, the trees groaned, and he felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. It was as though the mountain itself had entrusted her with the knowledge of all those who had come before, and he understood then that the eyeless child was more than a human being. She was the keeper of a lineage steeped in secrets, suffering, and something that had outlasted time itself, seeing what no one else could, carrying the legacy of the hollow in her very bones.